November 9th, 1943, 28,000 feet above Cologne, Germany. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen's hands tightened on the control column of his Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter as he stared at the impossible sight ahead. The twin-engine aircraft fleeing through the moonlit sky wasn't running away in the traditional sense. It was simply leaving. No evasive maneuvers, no desperate jinking, just a straight line into the darkness at a speed that made Jonen's blood run cold. His radar operator, Feldwebel Paul Mahl, called out the closing distance. 800 meters, Herr Hauptmann, 750. 700. Then silence. Then the distance started increasing. 750. 800. The British aircraft was accelerating away from them as if Jonen's fighter were standing still. "It's impossible," Mahl whispered. "We're at full throttle, maximum continuous power. We should be gaining on them." Jonen had intercepted hundreds of British bombers over Germany. He knew every Allied aircraft by silhouette, by sound, by the way they moved through the air. But this thing, this wooden mosquito of an airplane, was rewriting everything he thought he knew about aerial warfare. The British called it the Mosquito. German pilots had another name for it. They called it the Invisible One, the Impossible One, or most commonly, the Devil's Violin, because of the distinctive sound its twin Merlin engines made at high power. What Jonen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling helplessly below these British intruders could have imagined, was that they were facing the most successful combat aircraft of the Second World War. A bomber that carried no defensive guns because it didn't need them. A fighter that could outrun anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. A reconnaissance plane that photographed German positions with impunity, while German fighters burned their engines trying to catch it. The mathematics of humiliation were written in speed and altitude. The Mosquito cruising at 400 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, while German interceptors struggled to reach 350 at that altitude. The gap between expectation and reality was measured in the ever-increasing distance between hunter and prey. By the time the war ended, German pilots would develop something close to psychological trauma at the sound of Merlin engines at high altitude. The Mosquito represented everything the Third Reich had gotten wrong about aircraft design, everything British engineering had gotten right, and the complete failure of German assumptions about what was possible in aviation. The story begins not with triumph, but with desperation. June 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its heavy equipment. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Europe, and invasion seemed inevitable. In the halls of the Air Ministry in London, officials were making impossible calculations. Britain needed bombers to strike back at Germany, fighters to defend the homeland, reconnaissance aircraft to monitor the enemy, and trainers to produce new pilots. They needed all of this immediately, and they had neither the resources nor the time to build separate aircraft for each role. Geoffrey de Havilland had been designing aircraft since 1910. At 58 years old, he was one of Britain's most experienced aeronautical engineers, with a reputation for innovative thinking that sometimes bordered on the radical. His company, de Havilland Aircraft Company, had produced everything from fighters to airliners. But in September 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, de Havilland proposed something that made Air Ministry officials question his sanity. He wanted to build a bomber out of wood, not just any wood, but a special laminated construction that his team had been developing for years. The aircraft would be unarmed, carrying no defensive guns, no turrets, no gunners. It would rely entirely on speed for survival. It would be powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants used in Spitfires and Hurricanes, engines that were in desperately short supply. And it would be built by furniture makers, piano manufacturers, and carpenters because Britain's metal workers were already overwhelmed building conventional aircraft. The Air Ministry's response was predictable. They rejected the proposal immediately. Wood was outdated, a material from the last war. Modern combat aircraft were built from aluminum. Everyone knew this. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it. And surely de Havilland knew it too. An unarmed bomber was suicide. The Luftwaffe would tear it apart. And wasting precious Merlin engines on what was essentially a flying coffin made from plywood was unconscionable. But de Havilland was stubborn. He knew something the Air Ministry didn't. His wooden construction wasn't traditional. It was a revolutionary technique called the sandwich method. Two thin layers of birch plywood wrapped around a core of lightweight balsa wood, creating a structure that was stronger than aluminum for its weight. The wood could be shaped into smooth, aerodynamic curves that metal construction couldn't match. And most importantly, it could be built by workers who had never seen an aircraft factory, using tools and techniques from furniture making. By December 1939, as the phony war dragged on, de Havilland received permission to build a single prototype. The Air Ministry remained skeptical, but they were desperate enough to let him try. The contract specified a high-speed bomber capable of carrying 1,000 pounds of bombs to Berlin and back. It needed to reach 400 miles per hour to outrun German fighters. Most officials thought this was fantasy. De Havilland thought it was conservative. The prototype took shape in a small facility at Salisbury Hall, a requisitioned country estate north of London. The construction technique was unlike anything seen in aircraft manufacturing. Sheets of birch plywood were glued to balsa wood cores, then pressed into shape in heated molds. The fuselage was built in two halves, each molded as a complete shell, then joined together. There were no rivets, no metal frames, just smooth wooden curves bonded with glue. Workers discovered they were building an aircraft with techniques they'd learned making furniture. The precision required was actually less demanding than metal construction. Wood could be shaped, sanded, and fitted without the specialized tools needed for aluminum. If a part didn't fit perfectly, you could shave it down. Try that with a metal aircraft, and you'd ruin the structural integrity. The prototype, designated W4050, first flew on November 25, 1940. Test pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, took it up from Hatfield Aerodrome. His report was clinical but couldn't hide his excitement. The aircraft handled beautifully. It was stable, responsive, and fast. Very fast. On only its third test flight, with the engines not even fully run in, it reached 388 miles per hour. The Air Ministry's skepticism began to crack. Here was an unarmed bomber flying faster than the Spitfires defending Britain, built mostly from wood by furniture workers, using a construction method that simplified production and carrying a respectable bomb load. Maybe de Havilland wasn't crazy after all. But it was the reconnaissance trials that truly changed minds. In February 1941, a Mosquito was fitted with cameras and sent to photograph German positions in France. The pilot flew the entire mission at 29,000 feet, cruising at 370 miles per hour. German fighters tried to intercept. They couldn't get close. Anti-aircraft guns threw up curtains of flak. The Mosquito flew above them. The photographs came back crystal clear. Every detail of German fortifications, every aircraft on the ground, every movement of troops and equipment, and the reconnaissance Mosquito hadn't fired a single shot or dropped a single bomb. It had simply flown over heavily defended territory, taken pictures, and flown home. The pilot reported the experience as almost boring. No one had come close to touching him. Wing Commander Jeffrey de Havilland, the designer's nephew and chief test pilot, put it simply in his report to the Air Ministry. This aircraft makes a mockery of conventional fighter defense. The Germans can see us. They can track us on radar. They can launch fighters to intercept us. But they cannot catch us. We are simply faster than anything they have. Orders began flowing in. The Royal Air Force wanted photo reconnaissance Mosquitoes immediately. They wanted bomber versions. They wanted fighter versions with cannons and machine guns. They wanted night fighter versions with radar. They wanted them by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The Wooden Wonder, as it was becoming known, was about to go to war. Production expansion revealed the genius of de Havilland's construction method. The main assembly plant at Hatfield was soon joined by factories across Britain and the Commonwealth. Furniture manufacturers in High Wycombe, traditional craftsmen who'd made chairs and tables for generations, were building fuselage sections. Piano makers in London were creating wing components. A company that normally built wooden speedboats was producing tail sections. In Canada, de Havilland's Canadian subsidiary began production. In Australia, another assembly line started up. All of these factories, thousands of miles apart, were building identical aircraft using wooden construction techniques that required minimal specialized tooling. You couldn't do this with aluminum aircraft. Metal construction required huge presses, specialized riveters, and trained metalworkers. Wood required skilled hands, sharp tools, and knowledge of how grain and glue behaved. Britain had plenty of people with those skills. The first operational Mosquito Squadron, No. 105 Squadron RAF, began operations in November 1941. Their mission was daylight bombing raids on German targets, and their orders reflected the aircraft's unique capabilities. Fly fast, fly high, don't get hit. If German fighters appear, simply accelerate away. The Mosquito can outrun anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. Use that advantage. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Slade flew one of the first operational missions, a daring raid on a Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway. His account, recorded in the squadron diary, captured the experience perfectly. We approached at 200 feet, pushed the throttles forward, and the Mosquito leapt ahead like a racehorse. We dropped our bombs and turned for home. The Germans fired everything they had at us. We were gone before they could adjust their aim. The whole raid took minutes. We were back in England before the Germans even sent up fighters, but it was the high-altitude missions that truly showcased the Mosquito's capabilities. Throughout 1942, photo reconnaissance Mosquitoes flew daily missions over Germany, France, and the Low Countries. They photographed every major German installation, every factory, every military base. German fighters were scrambled constantly to intercept them. None succeeded. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a skilled German pilot who would eventually be credited with 33 victories, described his first encounter with a Mosquito in his combat diary. September 1942, we were scrambled to intercept a high-flying reconnaissance aircraft over Bremen. I climbed to my maximum altitude, 9,000 meters, my engine straining in the thin air. I could see the Mosquito, a tiny speck far above me. I gave chase for 20 minutes, burning fuel at an alarming rate. The distance never closed. Eventually, I had to break off and return to base. My engine had been running at emergency power for so long that it required a complete overhaul. The British aircraft flew home without even noticing I was there. German fighter tactics evolved in response to the Mosquito threat. They tried high-altitude interceptions, positioning fighters above the usual Mosquito operating altitude and diving on them. The Mosquitoes simply accelerated in the dive, reaching speeds that made German fighters' controls lock up from compressibility effects. They tried coordinated attacks with multiple fighters converging from different angles. The Mosquitoes would spot them coming and change course, their superior speed allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's best fighter at low and medium altitudes, was completely outclassed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could barely reach the Mosquito's operating altitude, and when it did, it had no speed advantage. Even the specialized high-altitude fighters the Germans developed struggled to catch the wooden British bomber. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who would become the highest-scoring night fighter ace in history with 121 victories, encountered Mosquitoes regularly during his night fighting career. He wrote in his post-war memoir that the Mosquito was the only Allied aircraft he genuinely feared. You could hear them coming, that distinctive sound of Merlin engines at high power. You knew they were there, but catching them was nearly impossible. They were faster than our night fighters, more maneuverable than our bombers, and they struck with precision that made them far more dangerous than their bomb load suggested. The Mosquito's ability to deliver precision strikes became legendary. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Luftwaffe had planned massive celebrations in Berlin. Hermann Göring was scheduled to give a speech at 11 in the morning. 3 Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron were given a special assignment: interrupt the festivities. The crews took off from England and flew across the North Sea at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. As they approached Berlin, they climbed rapidly to 20,000 feet. At exactly 11 o'clock, as Göring began speaking, the Mosquitoes roared over Berlin and dropped their bombs. The explosions could be heard in the broadcast. Göring's speech was interrupted mid-sentence. He fled the podium in humiliation. The German propaganda machine tried to minimize the incident, but the damage was done. 3 wooden British bombers had penetrated the heart of the Reich in broad daylight, struck during a major propaganda event, and escaped without a scratch. Not a single German fighter had gotten close enough to fire a shot. Squadron leader Robert Bateson, who led the raid, reported that the mission was textbook perfect. We saw German fighters climbing to intercept as we approached Berlin. We simply pushed the throttles forward and left them behind. After dropping our bombs, we dove away at full speed. By the time the Germans organized a proper response, we were already halfway back to England. The whole thing felt almost too easy. But it was the raid on Amiens prison in February 1944 that truly demonstrated the Mosquito's precision capabilities. The Gestapo was holding over 100 members of the French resistance in Amiens prison, scheduled for execution. The French underground sent a desperate message to London. Could the RAF help? The prison walls were 3 feet thick. The buildings were solid stone, and the target was in the middle of a French city, surrounded by civilian homes. Any bombing error would kill innocent French citizens. The mission required pinpoint accuracy that most bombers couldn't achieve, but Mosquitoes could. Group Captain Percy Pickard led the raid on February 18, 1944. 19 Mosquitoes flew at treetop level across the English Channel and into occupied France. They approached Amiens at less than 50 feet, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning. As they reached the prison, they climbed just high enough to drop their bombs accurately, then dove back to ground level. The first wave dropped delayed action bombs on the prison walls, blowing massive holes in the perimeter. The second wave dropped bombs on the guards' quarters and administrative buildings. The third wave provided top cover, ready to strafe any German reinforcements. The entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes. The results were extraordinary. The prison walls were breached in multiple places. Over 200 prisoners escaped, including more than 100 resistance members who would have been executed. Civilian casualties were minimal. The Mosquitoes flew home at treetop level, arriving back in England before German fighters even reached the target area. Percy Pickard didn't make it home. His aircraft was hit by ground fire during the escape, and he died in the crash. But his sacrifice allowed dozens of resistance fighters to live and continue the fight against Nazi occupation. The raid on Amiens became one of the most celebrated precision strikes of the war, possible only because of the Mosquito's unique combination of speed, agility, and accuracy. Flight Lieutenant Tony Wickham, who participated in the raid, later recalled the experience. We flew so low across France that we had to climb to avoid church steeples. When we reached Amiens, everything happened in seconds. Bombs away, hard turn, back down to the deck, full throttle for home. The Germans didn't know what hit them. By the time they scrambled fighters, we were long gone. That's what the Mosquito did. It let us strike with precision and escape before the enemy could respond. As 1944 progressed, Mosquitoes increasingly operated as night intruders, hunting German aircraft over their own airfields. This was psychological warfare at its finest. German bombers and night fighters needed to land eventually, and when they did, Mosquitoes would be waiting. The tactics were brutally effective. Mosquito crews would patrol near known German airfields, watching for aircraft attempting to land. As the German planes lowered their landing gear and reduced speed, making themselves vulnerable, the Mosquitoes would strike. A quick burst of cannon fire and another German aircraft would explode on its landing approach. Then the Mosquito would disappear into the darkness before German defenses could respond. Wing Commander John Cunningham became the master of this deadly game, known as Cat's Eyes. Cunningham, for his uncanny ability to spot targets in darkness, he racked up victory after victory flying night intruder missions. His tactics were simple but devastatingly effective. Find a German airfield, circle at altitude, wait for landing lights to come on, dive on any aircraft foolish enough to turn its lights on, kill it, disappear. Cunningham's combat reports read like a serial killer's diary. June 15, 1944, patrolled Gilza Ryan Airfield. Observed Junkers 88 attempting to land. Closed to 300 yards, fired 2-second burst. Enemy aircraft exploded on impact with ground. Continued patrol. 20 minutes later, 2nd Junkers attempting emergency landing. Closed to 200 yards, fired 1-second burst. Enemy aircraft disintegrated, departed area. No opposition encountered. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Landing, which should have been the safest part of any mission, became a moment of maximum vulnerability. German pilots would circle their own airfields for hours, burning precious fuel, afraid to turn on landing lights because Mosquitoes might be watching. When they finally had to land due to fuel exhaustion, they did so in total darkness, resulting in increased crashes and casualties. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, the same pilot who had futilely chased mosquitoes over Cologne, wrote about the intruder threat in his post-war memoir. The mosquito turned our airfields into death traps. We would return from missions exhausted, low on fuel, desperate to land, but we knew British night intruders might be circling above, invisible in the darkness, waiting for us to reveal ourselves. Many crews crashed trying to land without lights. Others were shot down moments before touchdown. The mosquito made us afraid of our own bases. German attempts to counter the night intruder threat failed consistently. They tried keeping fighters on standing patrols over airfields, but the mosquitoes simply waited for the German fighters to land and then struck. They tried heavy anti-aircraft defenses around airfields, but shooting into the darkness near your own landing aircraft was suicidal. They tried directing fighters by ground control, but the mosquitoes were too fast and too maneuverable to be caught by radar-directed interception. By late 1944, the Mosquito Night Intruder campaign had effectively shut down German night operations in many areas. The Luftwaffe couldn't defend its own airspace over its own bases. The wooden British aircraft had achieved something unprecedented in aerial warfare: complete dominance of enemy airspace through speed and stealth. While some mosquitoes hunted at night, others led the way for the massive bomber streams of RAF Bomber Command. The Pathfinder Force, elite squadrons tasked with marking targets for the main bomber force, relied heavily on mosquitoes. Their speed allowed them to reach targets ahead of the bomber stream, mark them with flares and incendiaries, and escape before German defenses fully organized. Group Captain Leonard Cheshire, one of the RAF's most decorated bomber pilots, transitioned to mosquitoes for pathfinding work and never looked back. He wrote in his post-war autobiography that the mosquito transformed target marking from a deadly lottery into a precision science. In a Lancaster or Halifax, marking a target meant flying straight and level through intense flak, presenting yourself as a perfect target for German fighters and anti-aircraft guns. In a Mosquito, you dove on the target at 400 miles per hour, dropped your markers with pinpoint accuracy, and climbed away before the Germans could react. The difference in survival rates was staggering. The statistics supported Cheshire's assessment. Pathfinder squadrons flying heavy bombers suffered casualty rates approaching 40% over a 30-mission tour. Pathfinder squadrons flying Mosquitoes had loss rates below 5%. The wooden bomber wasn't just faster, it was keeping crews alive. On the night of March 18, 1945, Mosquito Pathfinders led over 1,000 RAF bombers to Würzburg. The Mosquitoes arrived first, identified the aiming points with their advanced navigation equipment, and marked them with colored flares. The main bomber force followed, dropping their bombs on the markers with devastating accuracy. The city was destroyed in less than 20 minutes. All the Mosquitoes returned home. The speed and precision of the Mosquito Pathfinders had made possible the most efficient bombing raid of the European War. Squadron leader Robert Palmer, flying Mosquito Pathfinder missions, described the experience in letters to his family. "We arrive before the party starts, mark the target clearly, and leave before the real fireworks begin. The Germans throw everything at the bomber stream, thousands of flak shells, dozens of night fighters, but we're usually home drinking tea by the time the main force faces that gauntlet. The Mosquito gives us the ultimate luxury in warfare, the ability to do our job and survive." Perhaps no Mosquito operation captured the aircraft's unique capabilities better than what became known as the Berlin Express. Throughout 1943 and 1944, small numbers of Mosquitoes, sometimes just 2 or 3 aircraft, would fly to Berlin nearly every night. They would drop a few bombs, create chaos, force air raid sirens, send millions of Berliners to shelters, and disrupt war production. Then they would fly home. The material damage was minimal. A few bombs couldn't destroy a city, but the psychological impact was enormous. Berliners never got a full night's sleep. Air raid warnings became a nightly occurrence. Workers showed up exhausted to factories. Morale plummeted, and there was nothing the Germans could do to stop it. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted that the Mosquito nuisance raids on Berlin did more damage to German war production than many massive 1,000-bomber raids. The constant disruption, the sleep deprivation, the psychological strain on workers, these things couldn't be measured in tons of bombs, but they were devastating to industrial output. Flight Lieutenant Bob Bram, who flew dozens of Berlin Express missions, recalled them with something approaching fondness. We would take off from England just after dark, climb to 30,000 feet, cruise across Germany at maximum speed, drop our bombs on Berlin, and be home before midnight. The Germans knew we were coming. Their radar tracked us all the way. Fighters would scramble, searchlights would sweep the sky, flak would fill the air, but they never caught us. We were too fast, too high, too small a target. It became almost routine. Berlin on Tuesday, Berlin on Wednesday, maybe Frankfurt on Thursday for variety, then back to Berlin. The Luftwaffe tried everything to stop the Berlin Express. They positioned their fastest fighters along the known approach routes. Nothing helped. The Mosquitoes simply flew higher or took different routes. They installed early warning radar to give more time for interception. The Mosquitoes were over Berlin and gone before fighters could reach altitude. They put night fighters over Berlin itself in standing patrols. The Mosquitoes bombed from above them. Oberst Hajo Hermann, who commanded German night fighter operations, described the Berlin Express as the most frustrating experience of his career. We knew they were coming. We could see them on radar. We could hear their engines, but we could not stop them. Every night, 2 or 3 Mosquitoes would fly over Berlin, drop their bombs, and disappear. Our fighters would chase them halfway back to England without ever getting close enough to fire a shot. It was humiliating. Here we had the world's most advanced night fighter force, radar-equipped aircraft, experienced pilots, sophisticated ground control, and we were helpless against a few wooden British bombers. By 1944, the Luftwaffe recognized the Mosquito as a critical threat. They needed a counter, something that could match its speed and altitude performance. The result was a series of increasingly desperate programs to develop high-speed, high-altitude fighters. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, a high-altitude variant of the FW-190, entered service in limited numbers. It could reach the Mosquito's altitude, but it still couldn't match its speed. The Messerschmitt Bf-109K, a refined version of Germany's standard fighter, had improved high-altitude performance. But refined wasn't enough. The Mosquito was still faster. The most promising German response was the Heinkel He-219, a twin-engine fighter specifically designed to counter the Mosquito. It had good speed, decent altitude performance, and heavy armament. But it arrived too late, and in too few numbers to make any difference. By the time He-219s entered service in late 1944, Germany was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured, and the skies belonged to the Allies. Even jet aircraft, Germany's wonder weapons, struggled against Mosquitoes. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was faster than any piston-engine aircraft, but it burned fuel at an alarming rate, limiting its endurance. Mosquito pilots learned that if they could evade the initial jet attack, the Me-262 would have to break off and land due to fuel exhaustion. And when it landed, Mosquito intruders would be waiting. Lieutenant Fritz Müller, who flew Me-262 jets in the final months of the war, encountered this reality firsthand. On March 20th, 1945, he intercepted a Mosquito over Frankfurt. I closed to firing range, a rare occurrence with these fast British aircraft. But my guns jammed. All 4 cannons failed simultaneously. The Mosquito simply flew away while I tried desperately to clear the jam. By the time my guns were working again, the target was gone. I returned to base low on fuel. As I approached for landing, a Mosquito appeared from nowhere and shot up my aircraft. I ejected seconds before it exploded. The British had turned the tables completely. We were now the hunted. When the war ended in May 1945, the Mosquito's record spoke for itself. Over 7,800 aircraft built, more than 39,000 combat sorties flown, reconnaissance missions that photographed every corner of German-occupied Europe, precision strikes on targets that other aircraft couldn't touch, night intruder operations that made German airfields death traps, pathfinding missions that led bomber streams to their targets with unprecedented accuracy, and the losses minimal. The Mosquito had the lowest loss rate of any British bomber. Many crews completed full tours of operations without ever being seriously threatened by German defenses. Some Mosquitoes flew hundreds of missions without a scratch. The German pilots who had faced the Mosquito throughout the war developed a grudging respect that bordered on awe. At a post-war gathering in 1953, former Luftwaffe and RAF pilots met in London to discuss the air war. When conversation turned to the Mosquito, the Germans were unanimous in their assessment. General Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe fighter force, stated it simply. The Mosquito was the single most effective combat aircraft of the war, fast enough to be uncatchable, versatile enough to perform any mission, built from wood by furniture makers, yet superior to our most advanced metal aircraft. It represented everything wrong with our assumptions about aviation. We believed bigger meant better, more guns meant more effective, metal construction meant modern. The British proved that speed, versatility, and intelligent design could defeat all of that. Oberst Hajo Hermann, the night fighter commander, was even more direct. We called it the wooden horror. It appeared everywhere, struck without warning, and vanished before we could respond. Our pilots developed a psychological block about the Mosquito. They knew that encountering one meant they were already at a disadvantage. That's a devastating thing to admit, but it's the truth. The Mosquito beat us in every way that mattered. The de Havilland Mosquito continued flying long after the war ended. The Royal Air Force kept them in service until 1955. They flew reconnaissance missions during the Berlin airlift. They served in target towing and training roles. Some were converted to civilian use as high-speed transports. But the aircraft's true legacy wasn't in its post-war service. It was in proving that conventional wisdom could be wrong, that the newest technology wasn't always the best technology, that sometimes the most effective solution was one that everyone initially dismissed as impossible. Geoffrey de Havilland had been told that wood was obsolete, that unarmed bombers were suicide, that furniture makers couldn't build aircraft. He built the Mosquito anyway. It became the most versatile, most effective combat aircraft of its era. German pilots who had laughed at the idea of a wooden bomber ended the war terrified of its distinctive engine sound. The mathematics had been clear from the start, though few recognized it. Speed plus altitude equaled survival. Versatility plus precision equaled effectiveness. Simple construction plus innovative design equaled rapid production. The Mosquito embodied all of these equations. It was built from materials that Germany's blockade couldn't restrict. It was manufactured by workers that didn't require years of specialized training. It performed missions that no other aircraft could attempt. Wing Commander Bob Bram, who flew more operational sorties than almost any other Mosquito pilot, summed up the aircraft's impact in a 1978 interview. The Mosquito did something unprecedented. It made the hunter the hunted. German fighters that had terrorized Allied bombers suddenly found themselves fleeing from us. German airfields that had been safe havens became danger zones. The psychological reversal was complete. We owned the night sky. We owned the high-altitude day missions, and there was nothing they could do about it. That wooden aircraft, built by furniture makers, defeated the Luftwaffe's best technology and best pilots, not through better weapons or heavier armor, but through pure speed and brilliant design. The final word should go to the German pilots themselves. At that 1953 reunion in London, someone asked the former Luftwaffe pilots what Allied aircraft they had feared most. The answer was unanimous. Not the Spitfire, though it was deadly. Not the American P-51 Mustang, though it was formidable. Not even the heavy bombers with their massive defensive firepower. The Mosquito, they said, always the Mosquito, because when you saw one, you knew you were already beaten. It was faster than you, higher than you, more maneuverable than you, and those twin Merlins, that distinctive sound, meant death was coming, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, the night fighter pilot who had chased that Mosquito over Cologne in November 1943, attended the reunion. He was asked about that mission, about watching the British aircraft simply fly away from his fighter. His response captured everything about the Mosquito's impact on the Luftwaffe. We threw everything at them for 4 years. Our best pilots, our best aircraft, our most advanced technology. We developed new fighters specifically to counter the Mosquito. We created new tactics, new weapons, new strategies. Nothing worked. That wooden aircraft, that impossible design that everyone said would fail, defeated us utterly. When I think about the war, about everything we lost, I think about that November night over Cologne. watching the Mosquito simply leave, its twin Merlins thundering in the darkness, knowing I was helpless to stop it. That was the moment I understood we were going to lose, not because they had more aircraft or more pilots or more resources, though they had all of that, but because they had the Mosquito, and we had nothing that could touch it. The de Havilland Mosquito flew 39,000 combat sorties during World War II. It performed every mission the RAF asked of it. It did things that aviation experts said were impossible. It was built from wood when everyone said wood was obsolete. It carried no defensive guns when everyone said bombers needed guns. It was fast when everyone said twin-engine aircraft couldn't be fast. And it worked. Better than anyone imagined. Better than the Germans could counter. Better than conventional wisdom said it should. German pilots who had dominated the skies of Europe ended the war fleeing from a wooden British aircraft built by furniture makers. The sound of Merlin engines at high power, that devil's violin, became the sound of defeat. The Mosquito proved that sometimes the impossible solution is the right one. The Wooden Wonder had the last laugh.